Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Patrick Harrington from Mildly Geeky in Boston.
And today we have on Carson from Big Sky Software. How you doing, Carson?
I'm doing great.
And we also have Ben Croker from PutYourLightsOn. How you doing, Ben?
I'm also great. Hi.
So we have you on today, Carson, because we wanted to talk to you about a little thing called HTMX. So if you were out getting your dog fitted with a pair of nudicles and the person next to you who's also getting their chihuahua fitted with some nudicles looked to you and said, hey, what is this HTMX thing? What would you tell them?
So I think I would say that HTMX is a way to add Ajax and WebSocket support to your web app without writing any JavaScript, just using pure HTML attributes. And that seems to be the best way I can boil it down. So HTML with attributes that enable Ajax.
So is it kind of providing sort of the functionality that Fetch, the Fetch API provides, or what does it do?
Yeah, you can think of it as an attribute, an HTML attribute based mechanism for implementing Fetch or something like that. Maybe a jQuery. I sort of came out of the jQuery world, so issuing a jQuery GET or post would be sort of the perspective that I would come from. But yeah.
Okay. So that's the big difference, though, is that this is HTML attribute based. Yeah. In other words, you can put some kind of funky looking attribute into your HTML and you don't write any JavaScript. And this just does the rest for you magically somehow. Is that kind of the deal?
That's right. So you just write plain HTML. You don't write much scripting. There is a way to do some scripting as well. But it's all attributes, very similar to when you create a form in plain HTML and you tell it to post or get from a particular URL, or similarly when you create an anchor tag, add an href to it. So it's attributes just like that, and then you can encode various behaviors using different attributes, sort of different behaviors that you want. As far as the swap goes, it expects HTML back from the server, so it's different than the way most people use Fetch or other Ajax APIs, in that what comes back is actual HTML rather than JSON.
So the swap is an attribute where basically it will swap the contents of an HTML tag with whatever it receives back from the endpoint. Is that what it is?
Yeah. So just to make it concrete, if you put, and the attributes all begin with HX dash, so similar to other JavaScript libraries. So if you did an HX dash post equals /clicked, for example, what that would do is it would issue a post request to the clicked URL and then take the content that came back from that, the HTML content that came back from that, and swap that into the DOM. And there's a bunch of attributes that control how that swapping occurs. The biggest one is HX swap, which you can say swap the outer HTML or the inner HTML or put it before this element. Or you can also target a different element. So you have a lot of flexibility as far as what you can do with that HTML. But I think the important distinction from other JavaScript approaches to implementing Ajax is that you're really working with HTML. You're not taking JSON and transforming it the way you would most other JavaScript libraries.
So for anyone who's familiar with Alpine, for instance, or even Vue to some extent, this is similar to those in that you're using custom attributes to do the thing. I guess my question for you would be, like, what happened? Like, what is the advantage of doing this? Why do I not just write this in JavaScript? Or was there a girl named Java that broke your heart when you were a teenager and you just refused to write JavaScript from then on? Or what's the deal?
I've always hated JavaScript. And that's actually true. I've always hated JavaScript. I mean, I've been a web developer for a very long time now. So I started writing web apps back in 1995. And I've gone through probably 5 hype cycles with JavaScript. And I'm a little bit of a contrarian by nature. And the original library that HTMX is based on was called Intercooler. And I started that way back in 2013. And I wrote it because I didn't want to write a lot of JavaScript. I felt like what I was trying to do was pretty simple, and I liked web development and I could get my head around that. And at the time, the big library was jQuery. Some of the other libraries were starting to come along and get more popular. But what's the Google library that kind of fell apart that they had where you
web
did everything?
Like Polymer?
AngularJS.
Oh, Angular?
Even before Angular, there was
Angular's been strong, yeah.
Yeah. So in any event, but I looked at all
YUI was, that was Yahoo though.
Gwit. Do you guys remember Gwit? Does Gwit still
Gwit?
exist?
I have no
Gwit.
idea.
Oh, Google Web Tool, or yeah.
It was anyways, it was all, there were a bunch of bad ideas back then. And so I was using jQuery like most people and just writing, little snippets here and there to make things a little more dynamic. And I had adopted this idea of just taking HTML for actually performance reasons. I was doing this really big DOM manipulation. I remember the project I was on, and it was just taking forever. JavaScript was taking forever to execute. And I found out you could just slam HTML directly into the DOM, and it turned out that was way faster. And so I did that, and I kind of wrote this sort of one-off function that eventually grew into intercooler, which was a similar idea to htmx, but was very reliant on jQuery at the time. And I found that I could implement. I was more of a backend guy. I wasn't certainly not a pure front end guy. I was maybe full stack developer is what I would say, but I couldn't afford a front end guy at the time for the project I was on. And I wanted to be able to do the whole thing. I didn't want that much interactivity. I just wanted a little bit. And so I started pushing this intercooler library and ended up releasing it back in 2013. And that grew pretty steadily. Got a lot of shit for it on like Hacker News and places like that. So Reddit just hates all my stuff. I don't know what's going on. There's some pretty, one of the guys, so I had an alert system set up for whenever intercooler was mentioned, which isn't very much. It's a pretty small library. But I got an alert and I clicked through to Reddit, and someone had asked if you were going to design the worst JavaScript library possible, like what features would you include in it? And one of the I think, I don't know if it was a top response or not, but in my mind it was just, I would just clone intercooler.js. And I was like, oh man, Reddit. Brutal. But it's all right. It's a different way of doing things for sure. But it came out of that mindset of more traditional web development, more HTML focused, and trying to keep things maybe a little simpler than a lot of the complexity that I saw.
I love it though. I love it. I said, did you write this because you didn't want to write JavaScript? And you're like, yeah, I hate JavaScript.
Yeah, I think I've said this before, but it's ironic. I've had to learn an awful lot about JavaScript and write an awful lot of JavaScript in order to avoid writing very much JavaScript.
Right. But you have no choice, right? Because that's other than now you've got a choice. You do have WebAssembly is a choice that you could use in browser if you wanted to.
Which is brutal. Have you looked at WebAssembly is?
So I've been playing around with it, and Rust is actually a really good language if you want to use that to build stuff in WebAssembly. It is still kind of, it's a little bit cowboy, Old West kind of stuff. It's not the easiest thing in the world, and it is still evolving. But man, it's nice that there is going to be an alternative in the browser for first-party executable thing that you there. So if you just can't stand JavaScript, you could probably rewrite htmx in Go. Well, Go in the runtime would be too big. You could rewrite it in Rust.
Yeah.
If you wanted.
Yeah. The last time I looked at WebAssembly, it looked like they didn't have a compatibility library, like JavaScript strings.
Yep.
And like you didn't really have a compatibility layer. Do they have that now?
I don't think so. I think you're still kind of on your own. And there are other things that you're a little bit dependent on JavaScript on the other end, on the receiving end in the browser. Okay. So it really is still more suited. So for instance, I don't want to get too much off of a tangent. We're a tangent, but it's fine. So for instance, we're recording this right now using Zencastr is what we're recording. It's actually running WebAssembly, and it does that to encode the MP3 recording. So it does that in the browser. Okay. But that's typically what you would use WebAssembly for, is something that is super CPU intensive, that could potentially be a lot faster if it was running native code or native speed code. But anyway, let's get back
to... The other thing is no one will ever give you a pull request ever again if you move to WebAssembly, because, who the heck would do that?
Yeah.
Well,
no, so the pull request would be in Rust. So you would get, Rust enthusiasts might give you pull requests for it,
A fraction of a fraction of a fraction, yeah.
All right, whatever, man. Mr. Skeptic.
It may be a feature. You won't be doing with PRs.
Listen, man, you thought Tailwind CSS was a terrible idea when it came out.
So pylons or whatever it was called. Yeah.
HATEOAS.
Same thing.
That's great. But so, Ben, we recently did an episode with you where you talked about Sprig, this very Craft CMS specific thing, and you ended up basing that on HTMX. So why did you do that? And, what are your reasonings for doing that? And what did it offer you for what you were trying to do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I should be clear. I only built Sprig because HTMX existed. So I was kind of watching the progress of Laravel Livewire, which is a kind of framework for Laravel that allows you to load components dynamically. And it has both a kind of backend side that plugs into Laravel and is written in PHP. And then it also has a front end side that listens for user interactions on the front end, and then some middleware that kind of matches those two sides up. And I was thinking at the time, well, this would be great to use in Craft, because while Laravel and Livewire uses Blade templates, in Craft CMS we use Twig, and wouldn't it be great to have this for Twig so we can write interactive components for Craft and keep all of our templates in one language, i.e. Twig. But at the time, what was missing for me was this kind of front-end aspect. I didn't want to build the whole thing. Caleb Porzio has actually built, this entire framework. So he's done the JavaScript side of things, the PHP side of things. And I wanted to be able to do this with a Craft plugin, ideally, and not have to take care of the front end. And I was looking around for a while, and HTMX was something that I came across. It was recommended to me. And at the time, which I talked about recently on the last show, but it was at version 0.0.3. So I kind of dismissed it immediately because I just thought this is far too new and young of a project. But then I came back to it and realized that actually it's the successor to Intercooler, which is actually very well established. And this is basically Intercooler 2 with a new name. And then I realized that this is and this was in June, and I think HTMX was released in May of this year. So it was literally just, had been put out there. Carson had just cut a 0.01 release, and I think it had a different name originally, and then renamed it to HTMX. And I thought the timing of this could be really interesting because, yes, it is a young library, but maybe I can contribute to it, and maybe I can help the development of it, etc. And from there, I decided this would be ideal as the front end side of things for Sprig. So Sprig actually is the Craft plugin, and the only dependency of Sprig, obviously besides Craft CMS, is HTMX. And that's great because it means that I can focus on the PHP library or plugin and maintain that. And there's somebody else who's very smart and very experienced in this, taking care of the front end side of things. So HTMX, Carson obviously is the author and maintainer of that library. So they work excellent together. And
so this is interesting. So you used HTMX because you didn't want to write any JavaScript, and Carson wrote HTMX because he didn't want to write any JavaScript. Right? I mean, that's pretty much what's going on here, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what it comes down to is we collect our snippets of code, right, that solve the problem for us. And when those snippets get too big, or we just find ourselves repeating ourselves too often, we package it up and turn it into something. And whether we release it or not is up to us. But I think that's kind of what we've both done in this situation.
So I do have a question though related to Intercooler. So why didn't you just come out with Intercooler 2.0? Why did you decide that, you know what, this thing is, I'm calling it something else? What was the reasoning there?
The primary reason is that because it was intercooler.js, I felt like people compared it to other JavaScript libraries. And I never liked that because, people, another JavaScript library, how many stars does it have? Okay, whatever. And, it would be compared with something like Vue or React. And
so you were sick of the Reddit trolls is what it was.
To an extent, I think. I just wanted it to have a distinct identity. And I really, I didn't understand this when I first got into the Intercooler.js, but what I came to understand is that, and one of the things that's very different about HTMX is it's an extension of HTML. It's not a JavaScript library. It is a completion of, it's sort of, in my opinion, it's how HTML should work. Why should only button clicks and form submissions be the events you can respond to with HTML? Why should you only be able to post with forms and not with anything else? Why should you have to replace the entire page rather than a component within the page? So I developed this sense that it's a different conceptual idea than most JavaScript libraries. So I wanted to move away from the .js world.
Yeah, and the other thing about it is, again, it is, at least in my opinion, spiritually in line with Alpine, because both Alpine and HTMX are kind of, they're buddies with HTML. They're like, you know what? I want to work with you, HTML. Like I want to be buddies. Whereas most of the JavaScript frameworks like Vue, React, even Svelte, they kind of give HTML the middle finger. They're like, I don't want anything to do with you.
Right.
I manage you. It's not the other way around.
Yeah. I also, one big difference between HTMX and some of the other options that are out there, like Livewire, is I really wanted it to be contained on the front end. I wanted you to be able to use I didn't want any middleware. We already have a good abstraction for that. HTTP, we have a lot of experience in using HTTP and HTML to communicate data down to a browser. And so some other inspirations around the time I was building Intercooler were PJAX, which came out of the Rails community. It was sort of an AJAX mechanism that inspired Intercooler.js, and also TurboLinks. And my problem with both of those libraries is that they required a lot of server-side knowledge of what was going on the front end. And I just didn't want that. More and more I came down to this idea that HTML the problem was HTML hadn't been completed. They just stopped for whatever reason at anchor tags and forms, and then put JavaScript in there, and people did all sorts of crazy stuff to make other stuff happen, and just seemed like nonsense to me.
I was about to ask if you ever have any anxiety, like what if you meet Tim Berners-Lee one day and you're like, oh, I'm the creator of HTMX, and he's like, really? You're gonna try to grab the X name? And if you're saying that he fell short, then I guess you're not concerned about that.
I registered that name in 2020, so HTMX.org
he
was
had
available.
his chance.
Homeboy had his shot.
Is Tim Berners-Lee even remotely involved in anything anymore?
No, I wouldn't blame him for what's happened. I don't understand the politics, but I guess
I think we should all show up to his house with these signs and just start screaming and picketing outside his house.
Jeez.
My understanding is that the W3C, there's the W3C and then there's the other group, and there's
the working group or whatever.
Yeah, working group,
yeah, and W3C kind of just stopped working functionally when I've never understood why they work on what they work on. Because to me, like, you can't issue a post unless it's a form. Well, let's fix that, guys. Like, go and read Felding's dissertation. You should be able to.
Well, what it feels like to me, and this could be totally inaccurate because I don't know the inner workings of the working group organizations, but the way it feels to me is that a lot of the people that are involved with this are involved with it from a very academic point of view, and maybe aren't in the trenches, actually building stuff and knowing what needs to be done to build. And in all fairness, the range of things that people are building is huge, right? So you can call yourself a web developer and you can be building anything from a simple brochure page to, some kind of a massive application. And I get it. Like, it's a huge range. Yeah. But at least to me, it feels like a lot of the people and they're doing excellent work. They're doing a lot of hard work on it, but it feels like they're not in the trenches doing this daily stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah. And maybe you're a little out of touch with what people need.
Well, I think also it's just not very sexy. Like, no one, I don't want to say no one, but it's how to, it's hard, like, how do I make HTMX sizzle? It's what web development was back in the day. Well,
right.
Okay. Why would I want to? Well, because of REST and HATEOAS. Well, okay, man. How many job postings ask for HTMX? Well,
And that's a problem. That's the other thing is, if you look at the job postings, if I were advising someone that was coming into web development today and they were doing it from the point of view that they wanted to make money, I would say become a React developer. And I know, like, the hair on the back of your neck just like went up and all that kind of stuff. I'm just talking about.
I agree with you. Yeah. If someone came to me and said, well, hey, look, I want to be employable, I would absolutely say React, no doubt.
But then you could also say, but if you wanted to maintain stewardship of your soul, maybe learn the fundamentals first?
Yeah, you have to learn the fundamentals of web development. We all suffer. I think, for example, my generation suffered from the fact that we didn't grow up during the CPU revolution. So older guys who are about 10 years older than me, they have a better understanding of computers because for them it was more concrete. By the time I got to computers and could intellectually understand them, they were, it was already 1 gigahertz chips and Unix was pretty baked. And so it was just, I didn't grow up with it the way that some of the other guys, the older guys did. And similarly with web development, a lot of people come in now and there's just no context, like what is HTTP? What is HTML rather than just, this kind of janky GUI description language we have to use every once in a while.
Well, there are two ways to look at that, though. And so this reminds me of a conversation I had with a girl I was friends with who was an exchange student from Japan. And I had a mild, infatuation is the wrong word, but I liked the Japanese culture. Right.
Sure.
So like samurais and, all this, I just thought it was really cool. Yeah. And I was talking to her about it. I'm like, oh, that's really neat. Like your civilization has been around for thousands of years and you've got this great history and, ours is so new and it's all, there isn't much depth to it and that kind of thing. And she's like, yeah, that's true. But, our culture has been around so long. It's also caused a buildup of a whole lot of really bad ideas.
Right.
So I think it does cut both ways that yes, it's great to have this grounding in this experience, but also sometimes having a fresh new outlook on things can be kind of useful, I think,
Yeah, definitely. And you saw that the thing that I always had to give the JavaScript kind of waves that we went through. By the way, I've always noticed the JavaScript usage tends to peak with market peaks. I don't know why that is, but that appears to be some sort of crazy psychological situation. But the one thing that I had to give the JavaScript community was because the HTML spec and was not moving, they almost had to do it that way.
Right.
And we're using a website now to record audio, across the world, and that wasn't coming from HTML.
Right. It's crazy. It's the same from my perspective, where I used to do iOS apps. And in web development was kind of like this, it's the little brother development or whatever. But these days, like if I was going to do a cross-platform app, I would 100% build it with React Native and Expo. Like it's just so much better than maintaining all of these separate code bases, depending on what it's doing. So, but I don't know. I think it's really interesting the way that things are evolving. But I also think it's interesting that you decided to write a JavaScript library because you didn't like writing JavaScript. And it is, it does kind of remind me, like we're big fans of Tailwind CSS.
Yeah.
It does kind of remind me of that because, so when I first started getting into front end frameworks, the big mind shift from my point of view, when I started learning Webpack and React and Vue and all this kind of stuff, is that JavaScript was now the center of the universe.
Right.
Whereas in web development prior to that, HTML was the center of the universe and you added in a little CSS, you added in a little JavaScript, and then you made your thing. But man, if you're doing anything in these front end frameworks and Webpack and that kind of thing, all of that is an afterthought. Like the HTML is an artifact of the JavaScript, and the CSS is an artifact of the JavaScript, and it is just a total mind move in terms of where that locus is. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And it looks like what you're trying to do is bring it back to where HTML is the center of the universe.
Yeah, I think that at least on the front end, and there's some you're going to have to generate HTML anyways, so you're going to have to know HTML.
Will you though?
Well, yeah.
Have you been to websites where everything is a div?
Yeah, I know. But I think, one of the motivations with HTMX was at the time, or Intercooler at the time, was that I was writing my backend in Rails. And I like Rails. I think Rails is a great web development environment, pretty small now. But I didn't want to, once you introduce a lot of JavaScript on the front end, there's a huge amount of pressure to adopt JavaScript on the back end. Because why have multiple languages, especially now that JavaScript has a good runtime for the back end. And I don't like that pressure. I think people should be able to use whatever tool is best for the job on the back end. So, if Python, if you're doing some sort of AI related stuff or big data stuff, Python has a lot of good libraries for that. And it would be unfortunate if you had to have separate developers to do at least a basic front end because the JavaScript was so complex on the front end.
I've had that discussion. So we actually were speccing out a project recently where the front end, it is going to make sense to do the front end in React Native and Expo because the target is iOS apps. And in this case, the fact that we can generate a website from React Native Web is kind of like a bonus, but it's not really the goal.
Right.
But I was having this discussion where, well, okay, you could hire like one agency that was just really good at JavaScript, have them do the front end and the back end. But really, it shouldn't matter because there should be a neutral API that the front end communicates with the back end, and you should be able to write the back end in whatever language you wanted. And I would rather have someone that was really good at building scalable backends in Go or PHP or whatever it is,
right,
and develop a really nice neutral
Rust.
API, whatever it is.
Right.
And then rather than having front end developers who are really good at React Native and were like passable at doing Node server side stuff, I would much rather have separate teams that were really good at what they were good at and have them meet in the middle of this neutral API.
Yeah, that's right. And HTTP and HTML is that API from my perspective. That's the native API of the web. We're using JSON a lot now, but it's not a hypertext, and we can talk more about why that matters later.
I got a confession to make, Carson. And this may change your opinion of me.
No,
you may not want to associate with me anymore, but I'm kind of having a little bit of a love affair with GraphQL, and I really am enjoying it. Yeah,
no, I understand that, and I can explain. I think I can maybe help explain why you're in love with it, and it revolves around the fact that JSON isn't a hypertext and just doesn't fit well with the original model that we use to describe APIs like REST and HATEOAS. They don't make any sense.
Tell me why I'm a shallow, horrible person for liking GraphQL.
It's a natural reaction. You can dig up people talking about how they hate HATEOAS or they hate REST. These poor API engineers who they get 1,000 API request changes per day, and they think REST is pointless, and all these stupid arguments around whether or not something satisfies HATEOAS. And they're right. And the whole point of this, or the whole reason this is coming up, is because JSON isn't a hypertext, and none of this stuff makes any sense outside of the context of a hypertext. So it's a very limit, because your JSON data is dumb. It's just data. So it doesn't have the encoding of links and actions directly in the content. That's for the front end to figure out. It takes that JSON package and turns it into something useful, right? And so it's really more like a thick client data API in that sense. You're not getting a hypertext back from the server. You're getting data, and it's your job to interpret that data and encode it. And as soon as you're in that world, you want the same thing that the backend developers want. You want a very powerful query language, just like the backend developers have SQL. You want a powerful query language on the front end, and your API developers want to give it to you because they don't want to be dragging their API around, creating all these little magical endpoints for specific things. They want to give you an open and flexible API so that you can do the same sort of development that you would have done on the back end in SQL or whatever. And so I think that GraphQL makes a ton of sense. If I was going to develop a general API, I would definitely be looking at that. There are issues with it. The primary one that I see is security, which is the problem with GraphQL is any power you give to the developer, you also give to a hostile end user who can just fire up the console and start firing off GraphQL queries. And so you have to be really, really careful there in a way that you don't have to be really careful when you're on the server side. Because on the server side, you're in a trusted computing environment, and you can just give the developers raw SQL access, right?
But an interesting rub to that, and we discussed that recently when we're talking about GraphQL.
Yeah.
An interesting rub to that is that if you do have a breach into an SQL database or my Postgres or whatever, because of what you're talking about, all bets are off and you have access to everything, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're dealing with something like GraphQL, you have to solve that access problem up front.
Yeah, you do. And so you have to think a lot more about security. But I have to say, sometimes when I've talked with the guys online about it, it's always hard online because it's just not the pipe isn't very wide. But a lot of them don't seem to understand just how crazy the security constraints can get, because you really need almost row and column level security constraints for a lot of GraphQL things, because one person might be able to access a given column in a given row and another person might not. You have to check that access.
Or forget forget even about the fact that it could be sensitive data.
Right.
And let's just think of it from the perspective that if you have this open API, someone could DDoS your server by just swamping it with API requests, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of my arguments for HTMX in general is that you can give if your developers can create the HTML on the server side, they can access your data store directly in whatever the native language is, and you don't have to worry as much. You still have to worry, but your worry is at the user level rather than kind of at the row column level.
Let's get back to HTMX because it's my fault. I'm veering you off into uncharted territory, and then whatever. But let's talk about things that problems that HTMX can solve for a front end web developer that you might otherwise either reach for a framework or you might write a bunch of JavaScript code. So one example that comes to mind for me is something like load more. So if I've got a list of articles and I want to load more, is that something that HTMX can then just handle the rest for me?
Yeah. So basically the way in HTMX, you would develop your web app sort of the traditional way. You might think, just web 1.0 with anchors and all that sort of stuff. And then you would annotate your load more button with a request that goes out and fetches the next page. So when you produce that button, you would know what the next page is. So you would just encode it in the URL most likely. Just like you would create an anchor tag to actually physically go to not physically, but to go to the next page using traditional web navigation. And there's a good example of this. If you go to htmx.org/examples, there's a click to load example, which is exactly that.
I'm clicking to load the click to load. All right.
And you can sort of see what the code looks like. There's a button and an hx get, which gets the next page, and then it kind of targets a specific element to replace.
Right. So as properties on the button, you give it a URL, which is where it gets the data from, and then you give it an ID number of the element that the result you get back from that URL should replace, and then people click on the button, and HTMX takes care of the rest in terms of it goes out to that endpoint, it grabs the stuff, and it swaps it in.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. And there would presumably be another button there if there were more pages that would say load more.
And the neat thing is, if I'm using this, just like with Tailwind, I stay in my .html document and I write it there. I'm not opening up a separate JavaScript file where I'm writing the JavaScript here and I'm loading it in the HTML and I'm reloading. Does it work or does it not? Or I've got, maybe I've got a bundler that's got to run. Maybe I've got roll-up. Webpack that has got to rebuild everything. I just stay in my HTML document when I'm working on this, right?
That's right. And there's no build pipeline or anything like that. It's just some straightforward attributes on a button.
So if you like Tailwind CSS from a HTML-centric point of view, and if you like things like Alpine, I think you're inherently going to like HTMX in terms of, because it just philosophically, they seem very similar to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that they're all three of those tools are focused on HTML. They're sort of HTML-centric libraries. And so absolutely. I haven't used Alpine or Tailwinds yet. I've played around with both of them, but I haven't used them in anger yet. And
one other library, and especially hearing as you came from the Rails side of things, is Stimulus. And this seems like it's very close to Stimulus in a lot of ways where you're able to, through attributes, talk to the server. It seems yours might be more concerned with getting HTML back and replacing parts of the DOM based on that. Right. Can you talk a little bit more about what are the differences and maybe...
I don't know Stimulus well enough to say, unfortunately.
Okay.
I could just give a quick overview, because the way I see HTMX and what really appeals to me about it, and Carson kind of already mentioned this, that it completes one of the missing features of HTML, which is that anchor tags, for example, you put a href on an anchor tag and you unclick, the entire page refreshes. And what HTMX allows you to do is you could think of it as like an extra attribute on an anchor tag, which is maybe, we already have target. So if we thought of target, you can, by default, it's self, right? And most people will be familiar with _blank. And you could imagine a HTML spec in which you could say the target is, and you type in maybe hash and the ID of an attribute or an element in the DOM. And that would then tell the browser that rather than doing a full page refresh, just make an AJAX request to this URL that's specified in the href and swap, or whatever the result of that is, which will be HTML code, swap that into the target element that we've specified in target. And HTMX basically takes care of fetching those HTML fragments from other URLs. And then the second part of what HTMX does really is swaps them in accordingly. So there you can define how it should be swapped in, and there are multiple ways of doing that. You can set targets. And I think that's, for me at least, a difference between Stimulus, or even if we're talking about Alpine.js as well, and HTMX. Because with Alpine.js, if you want to make an AJAX request, I mean, you have to inline some JavaScript code, probably use the fetch API, but then you need to polyfill that, etc. HTMX takes care of the AJAX request and the swapping it back in.
Yeah, because you might really use Alpine and HTMX together. Like they're brothers, right? I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't use them both together.
Yeah,
I agree.
They complement each other. Yeah, like people ask me often, if HTMX is so great, should I use it instead of Alpine.js? And really, that's the wrong comparison to make, because they don't do the same thing. They work very well together. And Carson's also in the early stages of developing another library, _JS, which is more comparable, I think, to Alpine.js. It allows you to...
Would it be fair to make the generalization and to say that HTMX is sort of Axios for HTML?
I don't know.
Well, even with Axios, you have to write the rules, right?
Right.
It definitely, you don't need Axios because HTMX takes care of the AJAX requests for you. So you could say that Axios is included within HTMX, for example.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a simple way that you could describe this to somebody. So if we were getting nudicles installed on our dog and someone asked us about it, we could give them a quick answer. And it seems to me that you would use HTMX for whenever you need interactivity with data coming from a backend somewhere. You need some kind of interactivity on the front end, but you don't want to go crazy with the JavaScript framework. You just want to stick in HTML, and it kind of is bringing the dynamicism to HTML. Is that fair? Is that like the scope of it, Carson?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I guess there's different ways. Like, what does it do? Well, it issues AJAX requests with attributes in your HTML. Well, what does that mean? Well, you can do stuff like infinite scrolling and active search and things like that now with just pure HTML. So that's a little bit more concrete. And then on the more abstract side, I would tell someone it's a completion of HTML. It's removing the restrictions that HTML unfortunately has had on it for decades now, where you can only respond to certain events, you can only issue certain types of requests, you can only replace the entire screen.
So it's kind of bringing HTML into the new millennium without throwing it out, because these JavaScript frameworks, like we talked about, they looked at HTML and they're like, this sucks. Like, we can't get the interactivity we need. So we're just going to throw this all out and we're going to re-implement everything.
They were right about that.
Yeah. Yeah, they're right about it. So it sounds like what you're trying to do is say, no. Let's not throw everything out. Let's see if we can pull this into an age where we can get some dynamic content, but without throwing it out,
Yeah. And that touches on the whole REST HATEOAS idea. Why is HTML worth saving?
Who is this EOS person and why do we hate him? I don't understand.
Why does everyone hate HATEOAS? It's a bad acronym, particularly these days. But
Avengers 2, I think, was the villain.
Yeah.
I feel like this is, I don't know why, but anything with hate in it, I feel like this is going to be canceled and replaced with something else. Like they're going to rename this thing something, but
it's a real unfortunate acronym.
What is it? What is HATEOAS? What is that?
Okay, yeah. HATEOAS. What does that mean? Let's see if I can explain this well. HATEOAS means hypertext as the engine of application state. That's what it stands for. And that sounds a little crazy, but the way I like to talk about it is, so when you go to a web page, just a Web 1.0 web page that, say, has a table where there's some links on the table, that you can go and view the details, say a contact. And then maybe there's a form at the bottom of the page that lets you add a new contact, right? Just a very simple 10-minute UI that someone knocked out. Mm-hmm. The thing about that UI, so when that HTML came down from the server, the browser doesn't know anything about contacts. It just rendered the HTML. And that HTML encoded the application state in it. In that, the data, that is the contact data that came down, included in it all the actions things that were possible to do on that data as HTML. So you have an anchor tag, you can click to view the details. You have a form that lets you create a new contact. All of that was encoded in the HTML, and the browser doesn't know anything about it. So the hypertext is encoding the application state. There's not a client-side model of stuff that is living on the side and that knows, okay, with a contact, I can render this client-side template, and it knows about all these endpoints. And so the hypertext itself is sort of encoding all the information about the data that comes down. So it's kind of object-oriented if you think about it, because the data and the actions on the data are all coming down in sort of one package. And that's what hypertext, that's what HATEOAS was when Roy Felding was describing it. That's what's different about the web model. Most network architectures before that had thick clients, and the thick clients would ask for dumb data, which is what JSON is. This is what we were talking about earlier when we were remarking that GraphQL is so useful. It's dumb data. The data comes down and it doesn't say anything about what you can do with that data. All that stuff is encoded elsewhere in the application. So that's what HATEOAS is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it sounds very, very familiar because when we were talking to Caleb Porzio about Alpine, he was talking about Alpine being a rugged, quote unquote, framework, meaning that if you went in and edited the DOM, it wouldn't break anything, right? Because the DOM is the source of the application state. So I don't know, he may not even know that he's doing HATEOAS stuff.
That's right. He is. And then REST was kind of there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes on when you start talking about REST, as far as statelessness and the REST pattern of URLs, which people continue to use. And I think that makes some sense. But all of that stuff grew up around this HTML oriented model. That's when Roy Felding, when he wrote his paper, his dissertation on the web and how it was different, he was talking about this. Using REST to describe the web, he was talking about Web 1.0 applications. And then that got hijacked by the API guys. The API guys, they started off, you guys are, I don't know how old you are, but you probably don't remember this. They started off using XML, which was its own nightmare. And then they eventually moved to JSON, and they retained that language despite losing the fundamental aspects of HTML along the way. And some guys tried to, you'll see some JSON APIs that'll encode links in really bizarre ways that no one ever uses. Everyone just writes, they write basically thick client code just in a browser environment where they process the raw data and then produce the UI based on some side-loaded logic that they have.
Well, I have an interesting quote that I want to read to you, and it comes from someone deeply steeped in the React world. Are you ready for it?
Yeah.
You ready? You prepared yourself?
Yes.
All right. This is from Ryan Florence, the author of React Router.
Okay.
Ryan says, there's a chance, I believe, client-side routing on the web is usually not preferred, which is ironic. Might be best for screens where the majority of the UI persists, which is an edge case. Browsers handle page transitions very well. Still working on my thoughts. What do you think about that, Carson?
Well, I'd love to chat with the guy. I've got some thoughts on that. But yeah, I mean, the web took off for a reason. There's sometimes a terrible simplicity, but there's definitely simplicity to the model that really works well in a disconnected network environment where, you look at what was accomplished early on with Web 1.0 applications, and it was pretty incredible. So I think we've thrown a lot of the baby out with the bathwater.
We have. And we did it for a good reason, as you mentioned, which is that the spec just wasn't doing what we wanted it to do. So just think about, we're talking about HTML web pages. Web pages are no longer what a decent chunk of web development wants to make. They don't want to make web pages. They want to make web applications, right? So the things that people wanted to build and the platforms that they could build it upon were kind of out of sync. So they're like, you know what? Screw this. We're just going to build our own thing. But I think you're right that to some extent, the baby did get thrown out with the bathwater because they're like, let's do everything in JavaScript. But you know what? This actually really sucks on mobile devices because they have to do all of the CPU intensive rendering stuff. And it really is kind of janky. They're like, you know what? Maybe we should move this back to rendering stuff on the server, which is then like full circle to the way it used to be done.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I definitely think that there is some of that. And it's interesting because I like that there's innovation, and I like that people are able to build something that doesn't exist on the platform because they think it's a cool idea. Like they could build something like HTMX because they think it's a cool idea. And I like that it is flexible in that regard. But I also feel like the platform itself not moving forward is kind of a big hindrance because it's forcing people to go off in all these crazy directions.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think HTMX should have to exist. I think this is how HTML should behave in an ideal world. It really is just completing the HTML spec as far as I'm concerned.
And that's a really interesting point, because Caleb had a similar point, which was that ultimately what most people wanted to do was like build a hamburger menu or toggle this to show and hide, or relatively simple things where it felt awful to him to go. And this is someone that he used to do lots of Vue stuff. So he's not just an outsider that doesn't know anything about it. He used to do a ton of it, but he's like, this is dumb. Like I'm most of what I'm building is not needing this full application framework. I just want to do like some basic stuff. And he decided to bring that into the browser via Alpine. And it sounds like you're trying to do the same thing for pulling in data from external sources into the DOM.
That's right. That's right. You can go and look at the examples page. Active search, I think, is something that every application can benefit from, and it's pretty easy to implement. I mean, if you already have a search functionality, it's a few lines of HTMX, right?
Right.
Versus saying, okay, well, now you've got to rewrite the whole thing and some framework, and you got to render now using some other whatever. It's just, to me, that's one approach I like with HTMX, is you build your app just using the standard web tools in a web 1.0 manner, and then you can add HTMX where it makes sense, where there's high value. So you're not just paying the price for a little bit of interactivity on your site everywhere.
One thing that I've really enjoyed about HTMX is that most of the time when you go to use it, you don't have to rebuild your pages or your application, because those will already exist. And sometimes you need to just pull some out and put it into its own fragment or component somewhere. But it's really, you don't have to heavily invest in it. You can just drop it in where you need it, where it makes sense to. And it's a very lightweight library as well. So it just sits there and you use it when you need it.
That's a really important point from my point of view, is that everyone is building different stuff. And React was born out of building Facebook, but most people are not building Facebook. So, and I'm not
Facebook.
Yeah.
My understanding is they built it because they couldn't get a comment to append after another comment in a stream. Like, this is, I don't know, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but you just slam some HTML in there, guys.
Well, it may be a scalability issue, right? So there may be issues with doing things at the scale that Facebook does, that they really did need something like this to, state management type of thing. And, I'm good with that. That makes sense. But not everyone is trying to do that. So it doesn't make sense for like a company brochure website to be built in React, because why?
Right.
Why? Like what are you really getting out of that? But similarly, there are cases where there's certain things I might be building that I might be like, Carson, I love your HTMX, but I need more than that for what I'm building.
Yeah, absolutely. So I get that. I get that question sometimes. Okay, what would you not recommend HTMX for? And okay, you're building an online 3D game, right? Or something like that, where there's just a huge amount of state and interaction going on. Mm-hmm. Well, HTMX isn't going to be good for that. It might be good for the settings page though,
right?
For that app, right? Because all that stuff is super crazy, low level WebAssembly, and you don't want to deal, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want to, your settings page, you don't want to implement in WebAssembly maybe. And so I feel like HTMX, it's small enough. I think it's 7.5K now, compressed, and it has no dependencies. And so you can drop it in and just use it in the part of the app that it makes sense.
Yeah, and the web development field is getting so broad. I mean, the broader any field gets, the less one size fits all ever works. And I think that a lot of people fall into that trap. They look at what's going on in the web development world, and they see all the crazy stuff that's being done with React, and they see all the crazy stuff that's being done with Vue or Svelte or WebAssembly, or all this crazy stuff. But unless you're building something that will actually benefit from it, like, just don't use it. Like, you're not missing out on it. It's not that you're inferior in any way. It's just that what you're building doesn't require it. It just does.
I think that requires a little bit of confidence, though, that a lot of people don't have, and I don't blame them. We work in an industry that's pretty brutal, right. And it's easy to get left behind. And so you kind of have to be a little idiosyncratic, or, maybe have enough experience to say, okay, this isn't the normal way that things are done, but it's still a reasonable way to do it. And it'll say, I think HTMX saves a lot of complexity for a lot of situations. And that's as a more senior developer, that's what I would argue. That's where I would argue from is, hey, let's just save this complexity for some other part of the app.
At the same time, though, if I had a friend of mine that was coming to me and said, hey, Andrew, I want to become a web developer and I want to make some money, what should I do? I would tell them to learn React. Like 100%, that would be my answer.
And I would say the same thing.
Well, but that would be predicated on that they had the mentality to be a programmer, right? Because if you're developing sites in React, you need that programmer mentality. If someone is coming from more of a design perspective, I don't know how much they would actually enjoy that job.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And it brings up a feature that, if you don't mind, I'd like to mention, which is HTMX. The way I built it, it makes CSS transitions really, really easy to use. So a lot of designers, they're familiar with CSS transitions, but then to make that work, you have to be adding and removing classes dynamically. And that can be kind of a pain. The way HTMX loads content that it gets from the server, it actually pulls the content down, takes all the elements by ID in that content, takes the old attributes in the DOM and swaps them onto the new content by ID. And then after, I think, 100 millisecond delay, swaps them back. And so that gives CSS that chance to do a CSS transition. So you can do like throb, you can make something throb, or you can make it fade in, fade out, whatever it is. So designers can, and they don't have to think about any of that. You just return new code. So a good example, if you have a table that you update a row in and you want to flash that row, you can put a new class on it, and then put a transition between the old state and the new state to have it flash like that. And it can be done purely in CSS as a designer. So you don't have to get down into the muck and start tweaking classes on elements. So that's an example where that's something that I feel like should be baked into. CSS transitions are great, but they require JavaScript. Well, that stinks, because most people who are going to be writing those CSS transitions don't want to deal with JavaScript. And so it's another example of where we're in HTMX, we're trying to surface technology that's kind of tucked away and can only really get out with JavaScript now.
I got to confess, though, I'm a dirty boy. I like getting down in the muck time. You know what I mean?
This is America, Jack.
But sometimes you just want to drop in a script tag and be done with it, and just get on with your day and get the functionality you need. But if I could ask a question, Carson. So HTMX supports IE11 out of the box, which is fantastic. It means that you don't need polyfills and all of this. But I just wonder, because I've contributed to the code as well, and the library is really well written and really easier to approach. But I'm wondering if you miss the more modern JavaScript language features, or if you're happy working away in kind of legacy land.
Yeah.
How's that been?
I'm okay with it. I'm actually a programming languages guy. So, I'm working on HyperScript now, which is scripting language to complement HTMX. I've kind of settled with JavaScript with, what is it? Version 5? I forget what is it?
ES6?
Yes.
ES6. Thank you. Yeah. I've kind of come to terms with it, and I've developed a style of writing it that I find I can keep my head around, and I just test it. So I like modern programming languages, nice closure syntax and all that stuff. But to me, there isn't that much value to updating the code base. And I don't want to get into a situation where I'm like transpiling it or whatever to make it work. So I'm comfortable with it. And there's really the only place that I really regret maintaining IE11 compatibility is the observer. The ability to watch when something basically scrolls into view. I have to use an older API for that. And my understanding is that it's not great from a CPU perspective. But there's a newer, more modern API I'd like to use for that. But that's really the only place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But at some point, I would assume at some point you're going to ditch IE11. Like, okay, Carson, are you enabling people? Are you enabling people that really they should just get rid of this damn thing?
Yeah. I don't know. Again, as a contrarian, I'm kind of, every time everyone says you should take that out, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on it. I assume someday IE11 will be disabled by some update by Microsoft. And
would you advise to any of your friends or family that they should be running IE11?
No, I would not. It's true. I'll have to think more about that.
Be the change in the world you want, Carson. Just saying.
I know.
All right, so you said you're a language guy.
Yeah.
Real quick, you had to pick a language that you've written something in that you just really like. And I'm predicating this with the fact that all languages suck in one regard. Like it's the truth. Okay.
Yeah.
But if you had to think of a language that you've written something in that you really, that would be maybe your favorite language, or you just had an enjoyment in it, what would it be? Go.
My favorite language, and this is crazy, is actually Java.
Java.
They've never gotten their frameworks right though. Like what the web frameworks, they just had that enterprise albatross around their neck forever, and no one's ever fixed it.
And you know, that's my issue with Java, is not so much the language, but if I were to have a job doing Java, the kind of work that I would be doing would be soul sucking. I mean, I would not do it. You know what I mean?
We called them the Java salt mines. It's true. It's really unfortunate. The JVM is a great piece of technology, far better than most of the other VMs out there. I could talk about this for another show actually, but I think that I'm not a huge fan of the Ruby programming language, but I think Rails is a really good web development.
What about you, Patrick? If you had to pick one language that you enjoyed doing something in, like what would it be?
Python. I actually, it was one of my first programming languages aside from C, but that was too low level for me. Python, I love the syntax. I love how clean it was. I've just never been able to get my head around Django or anything like that for doing web work.
Ben, what about you?
I mean, I'm a big fan of PHP at the moment because of how much I can do with it, but I do have fond memories of BASIC. It was the first programming language that I actually built stuff in, and I was quite young at the time. So I think it is a good language for people getting into programming, and that was cool. That was always fun to use and writing.
I loved Visual Basic back in the day.
For myself, and this is kind of weird, but I actually probably got the most enjoyment out of 68K assembler. I think is what I got the most enjoyment out of doing stuff in. And the reason it's kind of weird is that it's so low level and it's very repetitive, but there's just something about it. There's just something about the almost one-to-one mapping between what you're doing and what the CPU is doing that I don't know. There's something about it I just really liked. I can't build anything practical in it today. No one builds anything practical in any kind of assembly language unless you're doing embedded system stuff, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm teaching an assembly class actually. And so I'm having to learn x86-64 isn't as bad as x86. So thank goodness for that.
Yeah. And 68K, like if you were teaching 68K would be a wonderful thing to teach because it's actually very, very clean assembly language. Very clean.
Yeah.
It was before the AI took over and came up with optimizations and an assembly language that no human can write as good as a compiler can write.
Right.
Well, it's really cool, Carson. I enjoyed talking with you, and it was really fun to find out about HTMX, but I think that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. Make sure to subscribe, and if you enjoy the show, please write us a review on iTunes. Tell a friend or retweet this episode. We'd really appreciate it. Patrick said he would make this shorter, but he did not. We'd love to continue the conversation. Leave us a comment on devmode.fm or find us on Twitter at devmodefm. For the devmode.fm podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Patrick Harrington.
And thank you for coming on, Carson from Big Sky Software.
Thank you.
And Ben Croker from Put Your Euros On.
Thanks.
We should have done part of the show on Ben Croker high as a kite down in the dairy.
I didn't even get my last question in. I wanted to put Carson on the spot and ask him when the 1.0 is coming.
Oh man, thank goodness.
I'm going to stop this here so he can talk freely. Here we go. Stopping that recording.